In this most dangerous galaxy of ours, doom may come from countless corners, seeking our human end by bolt or blade or claw or maw. It is our fate, this endless war we are forever trapped in, a terminal decline where we must face and fight the end of all things every day. In many cases, we are granted all too much awareness of such calamities as they bear down upon us, howling their coming to the stars that the gods themselves may watch the coming wars with gluttonous glee. Yet others are quite the opposite. Patient are they, a lingering terrible presence, content to bide time and seize upon the opportunity to bring ruin at the hour of their choosing. Our tragically human conception of the passage of time is so inconsequential to these minds as to verge into hilarity. To them we are pests. No, we are bacteria. An infestation so beneath contempt as to barely factor within calculations. The tale of this chronicle is of one such war. A conflict fought against an end inevitable. Battles whose outcomes were decided millennia before they had even been fought. Know then that this is a record of the fall of Orpheus. The Orpheus Sector, located in the veiled region of Segmentum Tempestus, on the very borders of imperial space, is believed to have been settled first by humanity in the Dark Age of technology. What little evidence we have of this comes from Great Crusade-era imperial exploratory expeditions that first brought the Emperor's banner to the local volume, most notably those of rogue trader Lady Arcia Orpheus. The Lady Orpheus was the first imperial expedition into the Mandragoran stars of the Segmentum, intended to be a pathfinder for the true expedition fleets of the Astartes legions and the Imperial army. She discovered remnant human planets, much reduced in power and sophistication, dwelling within an uneasy parity with several Xenos species, although which ones we have no record, as they were laterally annihilated by the advancing Great Crusade. Notably, the systems catalogued were marked by the extreme age of their planets, the majority of whom were long since incapable of sustaining life. Such was the apparent age of these worlds, it was difficult to establish if their barren nature had always been the case, or if they had been subjected to some celestial calamity in the far distant past. Curiously, the furthest flung of these planets, the ones closest to the galactic rim, apparently bore remnant ruins of a pre-human civilization, although it appears Lady Orpheus did not examine or record those in detail, beyond noting their deeply sinister character. Although marked for further exploration, the Veiled region did not see colonization during the outward rushes of those late Crusade years, as the advent of the Great Heresy put paid to hopes of expansion and prosperity. Instead, the region, owing to its remoteness and navigatable difficulty, became a haven for refugees, corsairs, brigands, and all manner of galactic flotsam, dwelling under neither the banner of Terra nor the War Master. The Veiled region became a battleground during the Scouring, as fleeing elements of the Alpha Legion, under the leadership of Warlord Dynat Mal, claimed the volume for themselves, harrowing all Imperial forces sent to exterminate them. The last Imperial outpost in the region, a garrison station at Amara, was destroyed by the Alpha Legion during the campaign, ending what little presence the Empire yet possessed there. It became known as the Dark Marches, passing from Imperial concern for nearly a millennium. It was not until M32 that an incursion by the Adeptus Astartes Raven Guard chapter marked the first attempts by Terra to pursue the enemies within the region. While expecting to assess traitor strength, the Raven Guard instead found a grave. The remains of the Alpha Legion strike cruiser Occam's Razor had been grounded on the jungle world of Apollyon, surrounded by skeletal remains of 20th Legion Astartes, alongside, curiously, relics and war gear from the Iron Hands and White Scars legions, as well as remains of mutant humans, Eldari, Crave, and other unidentified Xenos species. With no evidence forthcoming as to quite how this charnel house had been affected, and with their vengeance denied, the Raven Guard departed to make their reports to Terra. The Dark Marches went relatively untouched for several more millennia, with the Imperium focusing efforts on the pacification and settlements of volumes closer to major population centers and possessing less dreadful reputations. This would change when, in 610 M36, Segmentum Tempestus was at the height of a renaissance in power Imperial chroniclers have termed the Rising Storm. Loyalist fervor, burgeoning in the aftermath of the Age of Apostasy, was at its apex, and with the Segmentum relatively unscathed by the conflicts that had marked that epoch, Imperial authorities launched numerous crusades to expand the Emperor's realm, make safe its borders, and bring its light to the darkest reaches of that region of the galaxy. The Dark Marches Crusade was an especial success, and indeed was led by Lord Tempestus Hal Orpheus, a lineal descendant of the rogue trader who had initially explored the region. Over the course of 150 years, the crusade claimed nearly 600 worlds for the Imperium, eventually being declared a triumphant success and seeing the birth of 4 new Imperial sectors: Haxan, Layak, Eurydice, and Orpheus. The capital of the latter was Amara, the site of the previous Imperial garrison destroyed by the Alpha Legion, sitting, as it did, on the nexus of several stable warp corridors. The worlds of Arcantus, Gedrid, and Midwinter were granted as prizes to the Astra Militarum regiments of the Crusade that had distinguished themselves most highly, while the dead worlds of the Meyer system, rich in mineral wealth, were granted to the Adeptus Mechanicus as their sovereign territory. Initial colonization efforts were deemed too slow, forcing the Administratum to redirect refugee flows from a dozen nearby war zones towards the Orpheus Sector. Such an act is far from uncommon within the Imperium, and was further supplemented by an additional invocation of the Edict of Transmission, an Administratum Act allowing worlds whose populations are in terminal decline to be forcibly relocated, their homes abandoned by the Imperium, that their human stock be preserved elsewhere. In practice, these efforts consigned many millions of human subjects to a dangerous journey into a relatively unknown frontier, resulting in the deaths of millions of souls aboard vessels lost in transit and on failed colony drives. In 976 M37, after a millennium of relatively comfortable frontier prosperity, all contact is lost with the Layak sector. While itself not especially uncommon upon the Imperium's borders, what with tempestuous warp storms of the galactic rim, the incident is marked by an unusual amount of obfuscation on behalf of the Ordo Xenos of the Inquisition, whose Segmentum conclaves seal all records of the occurrence, while simultaneously ordering Segmentum authorities to massively increase the military tithes on the Orpheus sector itself. The near-crippling economic impact of mass conscription, significant expansion of the sector's battle fleet, and construction of orbital defenses around key worlds halts all rimward colonial efforts almost overnight, further stymied by an inquisitorial ban on further exploration of those most remote volumes. A millennium of ceaseless military expansion, followed by consistent refugee and pilgrim population influxes, created conditions of significant unrest within the sector, forcing the first of numerous purgation crackdowns to root out social malcontents. The situation was primed for the disaster that was to follow, when heretic followers of the false saint von Malus caused mass uprisings on the world of Epirus and Kolskath, rendering both into wastelands and draining sector resources in the process. Epirus itself was a massive loss, as one of the sector's key agri-worlds. Famine would persistently stalk the Orpheus Sector for centuries to come, ultimately contributing to the rise of the cult Celastarii amongst the nobility and bourgeois of the sector, those who had suffered the greatest economic losses from the previous 1,000 years of tithe and destabilization. The cult's resources and connections would make them an almost impossible presence to fully stamp out, despite the best efforts of the Ordo Hereticus and the Adeptus Arbites. Despite the forever persistent machinations of the arch-enemy, this particular sect was not dedicated to the worship of the ruinous powers. Rather, the Celastarii worshipped an ancient race of powerful beings that cult dogma said were slumbering within the hidden reaches of the galaxy. Beings whose day of awakening would bring bloody ruin for their enemies and eternal life for their supplicants. Ordo Hereticus records one has been permitted access to state that religious ceremonies were held by the cults around recovered xenoarchaeological artifacts of unknown provenance, rites that were often cannibalistic in nature. The tensions within the sector came to a bloody apogee between 860 and 903 M39, when disaffected nobles, chartists, and officiants began a series of bloody vendettas that dragged the sector into internecine bedlam. The House of Orpheus had decades prior been replaced in its gubernatorial role by the House of Lan, a decadent aristocratic lineage renowned for their profligacy, whose corrupt skimming of what little fat remained in the economically strained volume was the final straw for many under their nominal charge. Tithe tensions and constant Xenos raids pushed the moneyed class of Orpheus into a campaign of assassinations, sabotage, and piracy, a tangled web that inevitably led to a full-on civil war when the honor clans of the Drusillan cluster seceded from the Orpheus sector, providing a rallying point for several other renegade factions and fundamentally undermining the sector's stability. Desperate to make an impact on the ongoing power plays, the governing parliament of Amraphel resorted to employing Xenos mercenaries, deploying the vile Crave against their rivals. Inevitably, into this conflict stalked the depredations of the arch-enemy, as, bleeding over from the nearby Haxan sector's conflicts, chaos-aligned groups provoked uprisings on Selicar and Apollyon, with demonic emanations breaching the warp on both planets and all Imperial control breaking down as hell stalked the populations. Orpheus's deliverance was wrought from an entirely unexpected quarter. Above the skies of Amara arrived a ramshackle crusade force made of a disparate collection of Astra Militarum elements, ragtag militias, and threadbare pilgrims. But zealots all, aflame with the glory of the Emperor and driven by an arch-confessor of the ecclesiarchy named Marduk of Helvamon. Driven by ecstatic visions he claimed were granted to him by the Emperor, Marduk sought to stymie the doom of the sector. A great calamity, he claimed, would rise, quote, "from where the light of Orpheus falls forever into shadow." Regardless of his motivation, the confessor's arrival, alongside his more than 100,000 fanatics, was a pivotal moment in the sector's history. The ensuing War of Faith pitched the crusade against the archenemy forces, which were revealed to have the support from heretic Astartes of the Alpha Legion, Night Lords, and Deathmongers. Accordingly, the Angels' Revenant chapter of the Adeptus Astartes, alongside the Order of the Valorous Heart of the Adeptus Sororitas, responded hastily to the petitions of aid from the Arch-Confessor, supplemented by a task force from the Segmentum's Ordo Malleus Inquisitorial Conclave. This escalated conflict ultimately lasted 2 decades, and put to death a full 20% of the sector's population in its calamity. The climactic battle over the world of Kolskath remained for a millennia a curious and enduring mystery, until later events brought revelation to its sorry tale. The planet, heavily fortified by the warped smiths of the Deathmonger heretic Astartes, was besieged by Marduk himself, with the full might of the surviving baseline human crusaders. Rather than involving his Astartes and Sororitas allies, Marduk decreed the Emperor had wished for the common soldiery to claim the world in his name. Indeed, the Archconfessor was initially quite successful. His final communiques to nearby Imperial forces were full of his customary fiery vigor, stating that the faithful had broken the orbital cordon and forced multiple landing zones into heretic territory. Only, suddenly, for astropathic communication to cease, save for a garbled message of pure alarm. An intervening Angel's Revenant strike cruiser, rushing to the aid of the crusade and believing a hitherto unknown heretic force had suddenly joined the battle, was ambushed as soon as it translated in-system by two small but extraordinarily powerful void ships. They resembled no vessel on record that the chapter had ever encountered, and the exotic weapons deployed likewise had no precedent in Astartes' combat doctrine. The strike cruiser was ultimately victorious, but horrifically mauled, managing to destroy one of the ambushing vessels before the other retreated. Sensorium suites recorded distinct energy discharge patterns, similar to those of the ambusher's weaponry, being unleashed further in-system, corresponding readings speaking to a massive fleet engagement taking place. Given the Astartes' vessel's condition, it could do little but limp in-system, arriving far too late to intervene in whatever battle had taken place. The mysterious attackers had departed. What they left behind was a graveyard, burning hulks of Imperial ships drifting in orbit, sundered by devastating weaponry. Survivors yet lived amongst the debris field, but below, the planet was a howling storm of radioactive ash and unearthly fire, seemingly all trace of Imperial and arch-enemy forces utterly obliterated. The world was renamed post-mortem as St. Marduk's Bane, lost forever to grand environmental collapse, but now bearing the name of the lost, martyred, and canonized Archconfessor. The crusade concluded on a grim note, and of the mysterious attackers, no trace was ever found. The rebuilding of the Orpheus Sector involved centuries of consolidation and repopulation efforts. The forces of the War of Faith were instrumental in the early aspects of the latter, laying down arms in exchange for plots of land on war-ravaged worlds, with the Inquisition maintaining a significant roving presence in the sector to root out surviving heretic cells and purge suspected populations of possible taint. Apollyon, as the center of many of the warp breaches and incursions, was granted to the Holy Ordos in perpetuity, becoming an inquisitorial fortress world, while the small colony of Libethra was recast as a shrine world in the honor of Saint Marduk, a cemetery for the millions of war dead, and a fortress monastery for the Angel's Revenant, who, prior to the Orphean War of Faith, had been an entirely fleet-based chapter. The imperial efforts and the lingering zeal of this crusade allowed the sector to prosper and flourish once more, despite the omnipresent threat of Xenos incursions from beyond the Imperium's borders. An Orc invasion, for example, was thoroughly crushed by Orphean regiments in 319 M40, but while the Resurgence sector established itself in admirable time, the first half of M41 was marked by a reversal of those fortunes. The Decapolis conspiracy weakened the sector's centralized regime on Amara, while the centuries-long aetheric disturbances dubbed the Storm Tide saw the Inquisition conduct dozens of pogroms to root out unsanctioned psychers. In 744 M41, a curious string of murders scythed through the Kellerman Scolum, seemingly targeting academics sanctioned to study xeno-archaeological artifacts common across the sector, and, it was suspected, financially supported in doing so by the cult Celastarii. Witnesses to these murders, half mad with distress, reported a figure walking through flames, emerging from thin air only to butcher their colleagues, taking the artifacts with them as they vanished. In the waning years of M41, portents of doom, spread by mendicant preachers, became stock in trade for the major worlds of the Orpheus Sector. They were not without reason. The etheric disruption of centuries past had still yet to fully expire. Ships were being lost at a far higher rate than usual, consumed, it was generally believed, by warp storms. One such storm had swallowed whole the penal colony of Moros Lacrimal, rendering the fates of its 13 million prisoners, as well as several penitentiary hulks, utterly unknown. In 811 M41, a mortally damaged void dromon, belonging to the flotilla of rogue trader Caleb Gilderoy, approached the Adeptus Mechanicus garrison at Harrow Watch. Transmissions received from the vessel indicated the crew were in distress bordering on lunacy, raving about a terror, quote, from beyond the stars, that had slaughtered their fellow craft within the expedition. Begging for sanctuary, but receiving no permission to enter Sovereign Mechanicus territory, the dromon was destroyed as it refused to turn back from the defense perimeter. Matters came to a sudden head in 990 M41, when, after centuries of immaterial disturbances, the warp squalls within the sector came to an immediate end, seemingly as if some massive etheric shockwave had blown them away. Unfortunately, such an ending was no time for rejoicing. The resulting bow wave of psychic pressure caused a major loss of life amongst astropaths sector-wide, severely hampering interstellar communication. Mass hysteria, dreadful night terrors, inexplicable murders, and a whole host of violent delusions and criminality stalked the populations of the Orphean worlds, leading the Inquisition to presume that a major demonic incursion was imminent and to begin preparations for just such an occurrence. With Imperial attention focused upon the immaterial, next to no one noticed an Adeptus Mechanicus report that, within the depths of the forbidden Caracol system, a binary star pair had gone supernova, simultaneously. Such a stellar phenomenon is unlikely to the point of nigh numerical impossibility, but what was more curious still was its timing. The event had seemingly occurred, when chronologues adjusted for relative time, at the same instant the warp storms bedeviling the sector had blown out. Such evidence was, unfortunately, only discovered in the aftermath of what was to come. At the time of the twin supernovae, the Harrow's Watch defense station merely logged the incident for later perusal by Mechanica Stellar Cartographicae, and for forwarding on to the relevant authorities within the Imperium. It was, however, noticed by the magisters within the cult Celastarii. The group's writings spoke of just such an event as a harbinger of the time for their mysterious masters, an era of change, destruction, and rebirth. Many magisters and their acolytes, seeded through the wealthy and powerful within the sector, began to draw their plans for the upcoming time of revelation, while Imperial authorities were focusing their attention on the supposed coming demonic incursion. The signs were there, writ upon the firmament itself, yes, but also buried within the 10,000-year history of the Orpheus Sector. None could see them. So scattered were they, and so hopelessly ignorant of the horror that lurked beyond was the Imperium, that what was to come was effectively preordained. Had any the ken to connect these scraps of history, or the curiosity or will to follow the trails of these scraps, it is possible that billions of human lives may have been saved. Alas, that was never to be the case. When the attack came, it was not upon one world, nor even one system, nor even several systems. Scores of Imperial worlds came under sudden, unprecedented, and overwhelming assaults from quarters unforeseen. The invasion was so coordinated and so total that beyond its front line lay only the deathly silence of worlds that had already fallen to total annihilation. Death came to Imperial outposts so fast that many had not even the chance to scream into the void. No astropathic cries were hurled into the restive immaterium. Such was the destruction first that befell the rimward stars under the Emperor's light, that even in the aftermath of their doom it is impossible to establish the timing with which they fell. They simply vanished, lost in an instant to the Imperium, as if a pall of purest darkness had been drawn in a massive line across the whole sector. Of the worlds of Catras, Boros Landing, Palisite, Aerith, Epirus, we know nothing beyond the fact that the enemy came and won, and did so with an almost impossible speed. One of the fewest scraps of information that did survive was in a salvation pod of the Adeptus Mechanicus deep-range infiltrator unit Cobol Sigma, assigned to the defense station of Harrow's Watch. It merely speaks of a curious violence amongst its crew, rising instances of technological malfunction, and ultimately a disaster heralded by wicked, sickle ships dancing like carrion crows through seething plasma fires. It was the inquisitorial fortress of Apollyon that was first able to raise the alarm, when a badly damaged Ordo cutter vessel was able to translate in-system at Amara, bearing an urgent report of the sudden loss of scores of Imperial-held systems. That this vessel had managed to overcome and escape these invaders beggars belief. But with this missive, the disbelief of such a doom could be overcome by the unquestionable seal of the Ordo Malleus upon it, and by the Inquisition's urgings that the sector battle fleet beat to quarters and Amara raise its defense regiments and prime orbital batteries for invasion. Astra Militarum forces, mustering for the assault on the Kemarian system, were hurriedly retasked to sector defense, while messenger vessels bearing orders were dispatched to coreward systems, benighted as they were by the loss of astropathic life with the cessation of the warp storms. Only as these communiques were attempted by authorities on Amara was the true scale of the invasion starting to unfold, and the measure of Imperial losses that had already impossibly been incurred. The true nature of the invaders was yet utterly unknown. There was no after-action reports, there were no pict or vid logs, there were no auspex screeds, because the invaders had left no survivors. Messages sent to the rimward worlds were unanswered. Any vessel that attempted to pass the line of darkness that stretched across the sector from Tlaloc to Epirus vanished, presumably with all hands. Most disturbing of all was the silence of the shrine world of Lebethra, fortress monastery of the Angels Revenant, for centuries the sector's boldest defenders. For an Astartes monastery to be struck with so total an apparent loss was a portent beyond dire. What enemy could manage such a thing? It is perhaps to the credit of the Orphean imperial commanders that such panic as this information no doubt instilled was channeled into rapid organization of planetary defense systems, rather than some rash muster and charge forward into enemy territory out of blind, vengeful belligerence. As part of these preparations, Imperial and Mechanicus assayers bent every auspex grid, etheric scryer, and even optical scope towards attempting to glean information about the worlds lost thus far to the mysterious invaders. And these efforts came to naught. With little options, Sector Command dispatched military reinforcements to the world of Drusilla Majoris and Midwinter, prosperous and heavily populated planets that had up to now been core worlds of the sector, yet now became frontier worlds against the advancing Dead Zone. Amara, directly threatened in kind, pulled in armies and warships desperately from the coreward volumes of the sector. The governor, Calibron Lan, progressively stripped away shielding forces from other coreward worlds to booster Amara's own defenses, pulling warships and commerce vessels into a centralized fleet at the Battle Fleet Orpheus anchorage in the capital system. Elsewhere, Imperial forces waited for the hammer to fall. They waited for their skies to darken with the ships of the unseen invaders. The panic that followed the initial alarm changed within days to a cooler but omnipresent tension, a taut anxiety that only grew more so as the days stretched into weeks and then months. There was nothing but silence from the impenetrable front of darkness. No enemy ships were sighted. No word emerged from the gulf that remained with lost worlds held within its grip. Governor Lan was placed under mounting pressure to do something, anything, than merely wait in grim anticipation for the next blow to fall. Petitions from the nobility, Chartist captains, the militarum, and the navy daily assailed his offices, containing plans for everything from a naval expedition in force to a full-scale popular counter-crusade in the style of the ancient War of Faith. Several suggested an immediate counterstrike at the world of Lebethra, for surely the Angels Revenant were not lost. They were merely besieged by invaders, and desperately in need of reinforcements. Governor Lan rejected all in kind, fearing that to grant even a modicum of support or hearing to any of these plans would give ground he could ill afford, and was, to his significant relief, backed up in this by the grim presence of Inquisitor Lord Hiram Nitshona of the Ordo Malleus. Nitshona was the only ranking member of his Ordo currently at large in the Orpheus Sector, and one of the surviving Chamber Apollyon, the inquisitorial conclave, and thus a significant political power. Nitshona was ironclad in his belief that the calamity was malefic in nature. It was surely the work of the ruinous powers, for what else could so becalm the warp, corrupt the mind, and seize so large a volume of space completely and utterly? He counseled patience. Aid was being summoned from the Imperium, and it was vital the Sector Command make no attempt to enter the darkness until it had arrived. On 38-06-991 M41, everything changed. Whereas before there had been naught but cryptic silence, there was suddenly an assault of signals, a data storm flaring across superluminal auguries, blinding Imperial watchposts in a torrent of information. Astropaths reeled against the discordance of distress calls and echoing psychic aftershocks of their dying and dead kin, distorted into near incomprehensibility and folded in overlapping chronometric markers. It was as if the tormented cries of all of these doomed souls had been frozen perfectly in time, only to be unleashed in a single instant. Riding on this immaterial bow wave were other, far stranger signals. Blazing pillars of energy, spiking into the warp on the edge of the veiled region, unlike anything the Imperium had ever encountered. These pulsing fonts of unknowable power spilled off howling gales of radiation and charged particle storms that seemed free to transcend the gulfs of distance between stars in mere moments, defying the physical laws of this terraqueous reality. The storms of energy danced like static discharge along warp routes. Ship crews observed the phenomenon clinging like ghostly fire to the hulls of their vessels. A vile electromagnetic contagion spread with it, invading Vox channels, destroying the Jinn wards of supposedly sealed and secure communication webs, fading echoes of agonized screams emerging from speakers. The voices it carried whispered in an unknowable eldritch tongue, sounds that were wholly inhuman, born in a language that rocked the foundations of sanity. Yet within this Maynarkh blasphemy, this aural atrocity, there was contained one phrase in Imperial Gothic, repeated again and again, a declaration and a promise of doom beyond inevitable. Maynarkh comes. Ave Imperator. Gloria in excelsis terra. Even in the nigh impossibly distant past of the Necron race, back before their encasement within the living metal of their necrodermis, the dynasty of the Maynarkh held a reputation quite sinister amongst the many factions of that ancient species. Their courage in warfare was unquestionable, Indeed, many other dynasties feared their battlefield ferocity to such a degree as to accede to Maynarch demands before conflict had even broken out. This was not done out of respect for their honor. Quite the opposite. The Maynarch's bellicosity was of a uniquely vicious sort. They possessed a spiteful malice that other Necron tier nobility found profoundly distasteful. Nevertheless, their ruthlessness made them a great power within the Infinite Empire. They drew the especial attention of Zarek, the Silent King, who often employed the Maynarch and its reputation as a tool of ultimate resolution in his policing of the many vendettas, feuds, and civil wars that constantly raged between the fractious dynasties. As mentioned, the mere hint of their involvement could stay the hand of less powerful polities. Such was their sheer malignance. The Silent King's favor also permitted them a great deal of leeway in the brutal expansion of their claimed territories. The advent of the great biotransference did not cure the Maynarch of their bloodlust. As with so many dynasties, the idiosyncrasies of their pre-engrammatic minds were metastasized when placed within the unliving necrodermis. Their seemingly inherent darkness of character was not purged or even tempered, but now enslaved in perpetuity by mimetic shackles and the tyranny of command protocols. The lower ranks of the dynasty were purged of anything resembling empathy or compassion, while its nobility found their worst traits elevated beyond what they had been in biological life. So too did their role prior to biotransference become even more integral. When the Necrons rose up against the Catan star gods who had imprisoned them within their new bodies, the Maynarch were at the vanguard, the epitome of the Silent King's most violent tendencies, unleashed against the Necron's divine enemy. While the Imperium has catalogued only the barest, most mythic essentials of this uprising against the deific, the Necrons are scarcely more equipped to scry their own past. Engrammatic degradation is quite common, some 60 million years later. But we must also consider that reality itself bears scars from this conflict. Even the greatest dynasts of the Necrons ill remember such a time, for their own linear causalities were altered by the forces they themselves unleashed to shatter their former gods. Only the Silent King himself bears the most fulsome recollection of what has occurred, and even his own memory banks are no doubt hampered by the hypometric weaponry his kind unleashed. For he is known to have removed knowledge of these devices and technologies from his subjects. So fears he their continued use. Having made their Faustian bargain with the thirsting Catan and gained their new bodies, the Necrons broke their gods apart. And it was, according to Necron legend, that by the Silent King's express order did the Maynarkh Dynasty personally effect the destruction of the Catan known as Clandugor, the Flare. Not merely sundered to shards like its kindred, no, destroyed, obliterated from existence. It is likewise said that, in the moment of that divine annihilation, the malicious entity cursed its betrayers, infecting them with but a sliver of its own ceaseless hunger, a curse so fundamental, so inescapable, that it was woven into the base code of reality itself. This is the so-called Flare virus, also known as the Flare curse and the Longing sickness. It causes those Necrons infected by it to degrade in mental faculty until the point they are little more than sub-sapient beasts, animals of metal that possess a ceaseless, tormenting hunger for the flesh of the living, a hunger their bodies will never allow them to sate. The curse goes beyond the mental engrams of the Necrons, usurping their necrodermis and resurrection protocols, transforming their bodies over time into hunched, blade-limbed monstrosities. These creatures, dubbed Flayed Ones by the Necrons, will debase themselves in a manner grotesque to all sane races of the galaxy, but ever more so to the Necrons themselves. To thirst for the viscera of others, to attempt the blasphemy of eating, is a horror most vile. It hearkens to the deeply seated dysphorak within every Necron, the terror of a once biological mind suddenly remembering that it is sealed forever within an unliving android body, unable to eat, unable to drink, unable to breathe. There is no cure for the Flayer virus. Once a Necron begins displaying the curious desires that mark the early stages of infection, their fate is wholly sealed. Cryptechs have spent thousands, if not millions of years attempting to find a remedy to the condition, to no avail. A legend persists amongst the Necrons that such a cure may lie with the nigh-mythic Valgul, the Flayer King, supposedly the only one of their species to have succumbed to the hunger, but yet retain their fundamental sense of self. Should this be the case, and should the Valgul even exist as a single individual, such a cure has not been forthcoming. As several inquisitors of the Ordo Xenos have posited, the Maynarch possessed such a bloodthirsty reputation that other dynasties were fully willing, and indeed gleefully eager, to pin them with the responsibility for causing the Flayer curse, defaming them in the eyes of all Necrons. Their overzealousness had not merely shattered Clan Dugor, but destroyed him, resulting in one of the worst depredations to ever befall the species. It is likewise verifiable in Necron historical record that the first instances of Flayed Ones were observed skulking in the darkest corners of Maynarch courts, and following its legion like carrion. The uncertain nature of the curse's progression, as it can infect by necrodermal contact or, it appears, interstitial proximity, made the already maligned Maynarch total exiles from their kindred within the Infinite Empire. They retreated into their core domains in the galactic southern rim, the stench of blood that pervaded their gatherings consigned now to their dark, grim courts, forever stalked by lurking Flayed Ones. Where once these worlds had seen the Maynarch hunt the servants of the Old Ones during the war in heaven, they were now lifeless tombs, wherein dwelled nobility contemplating their gnawing hunger for flesh. When the Great Sleep was enforced, the Silent King bidding his subjects to enter into stasis until the galaxy could be safely reclaimed from the calamities of the war the Necrons had unleashed, several dynasties, notably the Sautek and the Atun, counseled their liege that he should use this opportunity to quietly and peacefully exterminate the Maynarch. So reviled were they by the other dynasties. The Silent King, however, appeared to yet have use for them, for as the dynasties of the Necrons went to their rest, he removed cartographical information of the Maynarch's crown worlds from Necron archives and command protocols, ensuring that his red-handed annihilators would be hidden securely until their rising, safe from any opportunistic interlopers who would be all too eager to see them destroyed. It may have been supposed, by not only other Necron dynasties, but the Maynarch themselves, that the millions of years spent within the hold of the Great Sleep would spell the end of their lineage. That, within the stasis crypts, the eldritch curse of Clan Dugor would poison the soulless minds of all that bore the Maynarch cartouche. That what would emerge from the lifeless worlds of the dynasty would be nothing more than a horde of Flayed Ones, possessing no desire but to butcher and bloodlet with senseless abandon. Such a fate befell other dynasties, most assuredly. The Bone Kingdom of Drazak, ruled by the mythical Flayer King the Valgul, for example, or the early awakened Ithacus dynasty and its mad pharaoh Unas. Indeed, this latter dynasty and its heir, Altix, are supposed to have a curious relationship with the Valgul, although this is a subject best reserved for another record. Suffice it to say, however, no such fate befell the Maynarkh during their long slumber. Their stasis crypts persisted for the millions of years undisturbed, location known only to the watchful eyes of the Triarch Praetorians. Given that their rimward location was known to suffer from severe and destructive celestial phenomena, the Maynarkh had fashioned their tomb worlds with advanced solar manipulator arrays and hyperspatial flux generators to ward them from any damage, no doubt at great cost to the isolated and friendless dynasty. This apparent foresight was to prove invaluable to their survival. Many of their kin saw whole tomb worlds devoured by freak stellar accidents during the upheavals of tens of millions of years, but not so the Maynarkh. Warded from such catastrophes, and further protected by the danger of their volumes warding off expansionist lesser races, the dynasty persisted in silence. Intrusions into their territory were quite rare, but when they did occur, the paranoia and bloodthirst of their nature allowed no quarter given or chances taken. The intelligences tasked with tomb world defense would not be content to merely exterminate an inquisitive Imperial explorator team or kin mining expedition, but would awaken whole phalanxes of war machines and canoptek constructs to track the origin point of these trespassers and exterminate whole population centers to ensure no trace of the dynasty's existence could possibly be discovered. This paranoia should, realistically, have been the dynasty's downfall. Such a heavy-handed response would surely have drawn, eventually, the notice of aggressive parties, bringing to the tomb worlds a far greater threat than the Maynarkh could have awoken in time to battle. But so great was the ignorance, insularity, and fractiousness of their main neighbor, the Imperium of Man, that a realization never occurred, despite their having become the prominent, dominant power sitting upon the slumbering dynasty's proverbial vestibule. So consumed by conflict, ideology, politicking, and deliberate obfuscation was the Imperium, that none of the many signs your humble servant has previously outlined in this chronicle were heeded, not by civilian or military authorities, or even the Segmentum's Inquisition. This has been true across the galaxy. Within volumes quite heavily populated, undiscovered Necron tomb worlds have arisen in recent centuries to bring ruin to the worlds of humanity in the name of restoring the infinite empire, and in many cases, whole dynasties have gone utterly undetected throughout mankind's 10,000-year reign of this galaxy. The Orpheus Sector is not unique here. What is noteworthy is that the Maynarkh are perhaps the most objectively xenocidal, violent, and heavy-handed of the Necron dynasties yet encountered by the Imperium, content to let their suspicion of intrusion and discovery push them to heavy-handed reprisals that risked precipitating that very discovery. Yet the Imperium did not respond, notice, or even really bother to note any of these instances. Wholly oblivious to the malingering terror that lurked under the surface of the dead worlds just beyond its light, the Imperium was utterly unprepared for what was to follow. Its relentless instability surrendered the initiative, preventing any chance of a strike at the dynasty while its greatest forces still slumbered. The signal of their awakening had long ago been seared into the engrams of the Maynarkh. It was a celestial configuration, a moment that marked for them the bidding of the Silent King and the Triarch to rise from their long sleep. That signal was the death of the Caracol stars. In this system there were no tomb worlds. Instead lay the graves and ruins of entities more ancient and terrible even than the Necrons, cast amid the dolmen gates that the Catan had used to wage the war in heaven. It was these gates that served to broadcast the apocalyptic deaths of the stars into the warp and beyond, a grand clarion bell tolling across the heavens, portending unearthly doom. It is unknown if the binary supernovae was the work of the Silent King himself. While such a thing is undoubtedly within the power of Zarek to accomplish, the death of the Caracal stars could have been something more eldritch still, beyond the ken of even the Necrons. It may even have been cosmic chance, predicted countless eons ago by ancient astromancer cryptex to occur within an acceptable time frame. Regardless, with the stellar violence came the rise of the Maynarkh Dynasty, awake now for the first time in tens of millions of years, and possessing a hunger within that defied comprehension. Many thousands of the Maynarch that emerged from the Great Sleep did so already terminally insane. They had been placed within their stasis crypts, already in the throes of the curse. Insane with the desire for flesh and blood, they awoke screaming in ancient malice, and from this hunger they created thousands more of their kind. As many more Necrons fell to Clan Dagor's thirst quite quickly, forming packs of flayed ones that began to rove the tomb complexes or disappeared into the ghost wind, the strange, ill-understood subdimension their debased kind used to traverse the galaxy. Still, there remained hundreds of thousands of Necrons that had survived the curse's predations, from lowly warriors up to mighty Lichguard, and the courtly nobles that ruled them. While it is likely all possessed some measure of the hunger, especially the aristocracy, many had managed to suppress the curse deep within the roiling core flux at their mechanical hearts, twisting it into something more enmeshed with their metastasized personality matrices. The more radical of the Ordo Xenos Inquisitors, who have penned treatises upon the dynasty, have posited that, perhaps owing to the inherent bloodthirst that had seemingly always been a part of Maynarch culture, since long before biotransference, they possessed approximate kinship with the hunger of the curse. Perhaps indeed a resistance to it that other Necrons could never comprehend. Or perhaps still, their fall would merely be extended, prolonging torturously their inevitable fate. It is almost certain that all Necrons within the dynasty that retained an ability for independent thought were aware of this. The gnawing hunger, the famineous ache that afflicted their cores, and were driven to nihilism by it, resigned to a life lived in defiance of a mindless end. Others likely hove to madness of a more violent kind, driven to effect carnage and slaughter upon a world they could no longer possibly care for or relate to. What saved the Maynarch from collapse into total anarchy was the ironclad will of the dynastic leadership, those sealed within the most heavily protected tombs on the crown worlds of the dynastic core. They, asleep for 60 million years, they who now rose, bellowing names that had once cowed whole arms of the galaxy by their mention. Ixatotek the Jackal Regent, Lord Hunter of the Void, Tlazalt the Faceless, Nemesaur of Tayrok, Mactlan Kutlach, the World Killer, and finally, the dynasty's Feyrak, Zunbakir, the Mother of Oblivion. It was these figures that imposed their brutal rule on the worlds they rose from, bringing the legions in line, expelling the greater packs of the flayed ones to the wastelands or to the ghost wind. They who took counsel from the attending and aged Triarch Praetorians. It was within airless courts, cold enough to freeze flesh to glass, that these ancient intelligences took stock of their domains, and ordered chronomancers to compress time and space that they may treat with their kindred upon other Maynarch worlds. They came to awareness of what had changed within the galaxy they had awoken to, of the rising bastions of the infinite empire, and, with a disgust, the teeming, verminous hordes of the unclean that infested every corner of the void. They appraised the existence of nearby tomb worlds belonging to other dynasties and former Maynarch satrapies, those that would have to be immediately brought to bend the knee or become enemies of the dynasty in their own right. One thing became clear to these nobles: the iron hold of the Silent King's command protocols, those that he had used to shackle his species during the war in heaven, were now gone. The Maynarch were free to pursue their own aims, chart their own course within the infinite empire, even perhaps to its zenith. The course the Mother of Oblivion bade was clear, and eagerly desired by all who called her Feyrak: extermination. Nothing short of the systematic genocide of all life would suffice for the Maynarch, and it would begin with the filth that clogged their near-space volumes. Despite her resolve and her hunger, Zun Bakir would not allow her dynasts to rush into the void to hunt. Patience must hold at present to allow for intelligence to be gathered, legions mustered, weapons tested, and the best plans laid. To that end, the fringe worlds that bore the tread of humanity, but yet contained Necron stasis crypts, were instructed to remain hidden and dormant, such that at a time the Maynarch were ready to attack, they could rise from beneath the feet of the interlopers. For all the engrammatic cancer that gnawed at their machine minds, the Maynarch were yet numerous and powerful. Prior to the Great Sleep, they had been counted not far behind the greatest dynasties in terms of direct military power. While admittedly hampered in their advancement by the deep distrust of other Necrons, this did little to diminish their efficacy and deep personal capacity for violence. Indeed, being the target of so many feuds and politicking that typified Necron society, in turn led the Maynarch to take what they wanted through naked, unrelenting force, where subtle means were disallowed to them due to their political isolation. What client dynasties the Maynarch took to their power did so with the direct threat of slaughter. What this had created, what had now awakened, was a force of utter genocidal wrath, one possessing hundreds of thousands of warriors, millions of canoptek constructs, and hundreds of warships. What was leveled against the Imperium was a military juggernaut, one powered by hatred and madness, utterly implacable in its desire to exterminate. The coming conflict would not be a war against an honored foe, but a dark harvest of the living, where the spoils of war, the very flesh and blood of those slain by Necron hands, would be reaped and given to appease the wayward children of the Maynarch as a vile mercy for those they deemed afflicted. And no other reason, the soulless nobles of the court no doubt told themselves. No other reason at all. To say the Imperium was unprepared would be a horrific understatement. Simply no one knew the horror of what was about to unfold. Ave Imperator. Gloria in excelsis terra. In the wake of the Maynarkh Dynasty's proclamation came a fear, as infectious and fast-moving as the technological plague the Necrons had already unleashed. The shroud that had fallen upon Imperial communication was wrenched back, revealing the horror that had already been committed. The 1,000 basilicas of Libethra, the fortress of the Angel's Revenant, had been reduced to a field of lava, the very crust of the world split and weeping under whatever planet-killing weapons had been targeted upon it. Apollyon, that bastion of the Inquisition, had likewise been shattered. The Necrons had caused its moon, Elohim Mortua, to crash into the world, ejecting whole continents into the void. The news spread like wildfire, the very communication nets it was carried upon continuing to swirl with the sinister glyphs of these mysterious invaders. Amrapel and Midwinter saw the outbreak of massive riots, lurching them towards the brink of total civic collapse as Imperial authorities attempted to suppress them. The hope of inbound reinforcements from the Eurydice sector did naught to stem the tide of terror. The first wave of the invasion had already riven the sector, with hundreds of millions of human lives being snuffed out in total blackness. What hope could yet there be? On the morning of 4/9/17/991 M41, the sun failed to rise on Drusilla Majoris, capital world of the Drusilla subsector. The 6 billion humans of the Hive world, gripped now within a night that may never end, could only watch as a dreadful cold descended upon their planet. All Vox traffic with ships in the nearby volume was abruptly cut off, and out in the ash wastes of the Hive hinterlands, eldritch monuments of black, impenetrable stone began to rise from the polluted sands, edifices revealing themselves to the terrified onlookers. Elsewhere, guarding the orbital shipyards of Midwinter, the Ramillies-class star fortress Taurus received panicked distress calls, claiming to be under attack from unknown vessels and boarding parties of figures, quote, fashioned as specters of death. Despite even the major worlds of his sector appearing to be toppling like timber, Governor La'an refused any order of aggressive action, retreating to a fortified bunker beneath the gubernatorial palace on Amara, while the tens of millions of mustered soldiers and hundreds of warships remained on station high above. One by one, the systems surrounding the capital shrieked for aid before falling silent, their deaths marked by blazing, corpuscent pulses of celestial fire, a stamp placed upon the realms once held by humanity, but now deathly silent. Amara alone stood to beg the Imperium for aid. In every other respect, the Orpheus Sector had been cut in half. The fall of over 50% of the Orpheus Sector to the Maynarkh Dynasty has entered into the annals of Imperial history as the Bloody 100, so called because it took less than 100 Terran days standard. To accomplish the seizure of such a volume in such a time as less than 3 months was not without precedent per se, but the chaos and panic in its wake are entirely understandable. Billions of lives had been lost, and the enemy had barely been sighted, and decidedly not yet confirmed. This was no Orc Wa, the presence of which could scarcely be any more explicit, or an arch-enemy campaign, replete with grand displays of debased religiosity. The Maynarkh invasion was implacable, silent, and supremely deadly, turning Imperial retreats into panicked, formless routs, snuffing out worlds with nary warning nor word. Victory after victory they claimed, seizing a staggering volume of space during the Bloody 100 before, once again, halting in place. On 3/964/992 M41, Governor La'an ordered the general retreat of every single surviving Imperial military element to Amara, hoping to use the reprieve to gather whatever scattered forces he could. As the days wore on, La'an's paranoia and mental instability, both of which had been growing since the beginning of the Bloody 100, appeared to become significantly worse, interfering with the strategic planning of Amara's defense. Relief began to appear in the form of out-of-sector reinforcements, trickling in from the system's Mandeville Point. Yet more sector local units from the Arcantis cluster, far behind the line drawn between the Maynarkh Crown Worlds and Amara that marked the invaders' advance thus far, likewise redirected to Amara, depriving them wholesale of any military protection. This significantly damaged Imperial morale and planetary political stability within the Arcantis cluster, with terrified populaces and ruling classes both now well aware of the advancing doom that was taking place across the sector. leading to outright mutiny on several occasions, only to be bloodily suppressed at the hands of Prefectus Commissariats and the Adeptus Arbites. The halt in the Necron advance granted the Imperial forces almost 3 months to muster, and this was far from wasted. The armies arrayed at Amara had grown to formidable proportions. Over 19 million Astra Militarum guardsmen, with almost 10 times that number in militia raised under emergency edict and armed and equipped along the Munitorum's Cadian pattern. One of the last contingents to arrive in system, and perhaps the most storied of all out-of-sector Militarum reinforcements, were 2 million soldiery of the Death Corps of Krieg, led by the veteran 17th Line Corps under the command of Marshal Caris Venner. It was, however, not only the Militarum that answered Orpheus's plea for aid. The call to arms had been heeded by several chapters of the Adeptus Astartes, most notably what appeared to be the entirety of the Minotaur's chapter, entering the northern reaches of the sector with brutal haste alongside a company from the Marauders chapter. Elements from the Red Seraphs and the Nemesis chapter had likewise delivered astropathic missives to Amara notifying it of their imminent arrival. The battle barges of these chapters, now numbering in 4, added their might to the armada orbiting the capital, several hundred escort-class vessels, and more than 60 rated cruisers and capital ships of the Imperial Navy. It was a staggering force of arms arrayed for the defense of a single world, even a sector capital, at least by modern Imperial standards, especially when even the barest hint of the enemy's nature still remained wholly unknown. Belligerent calls for more immediate action became more common as the weeks proceeded, but Lon and his advisors remained resolute in their strategy of patient, unyielding defense. The idea of a counterattack into the lost regions of Orphean space was simply not countenanced. But likewise, Lon forbid even the conducting of reconnaissance in force to establish even the most remote facts about enemy movements, strength, or nature. For all the world, it appeared the governor and his council simply dared not disturb the dark veil that had been thrown over the lost worlds of Orpheus. In a report laterally compiled by Inquisitor Scarman Havas of the Ordo Xenos, following the fall of Orpheus, Inquisitor Hiram Nithsona, high-ranking survivor of the sector's inquisitorial conclave and a close advisor to the governor following the beginning of the Bloody Hundred, was ruled, post-mortem, to have had his conduct in this period found wanting. Nithsona had been an esteemed and rightly lauded demon hunter of the Ordo Malleus for some 2 centuries, and his record was genuinely unimpeachable. The unavoidable conclusion of Inquisitor Havas, however, was that in this final trial of the Emperor's service, the venerable Nithsona had allowed his own fears and paranoia to become his undoing. From the beginning, as one has noted in this record thus far, Nithsona was adamant that the calamitous invasion was a ploy in the schemes of the dark gods of primordial annihilation, whose abilities to invoke malefic stellar phenomenon on a large scale is undeniably based in fact. Nithsona viewed the progress of events as merely a preamble to a greater threat to come, even as the situation worsened and no extant proof of demonic incursions provided itself in the least. Owing to this, it was laterally concluded by the Inquisition that vital intelligence was not given full scrutiny, or indeed was passed on by Nithsona to the servants of the Ordo Xenos, where Inquisitor Havas noted, with no small amount of prideful surety, actual value may have been gleaned. Havas's report points to Inquisitor Nithsona's close association with Governor La'an, and his inability to properly deal with the governor's clearly degrading mental functionality as proof of his lapse of judgment. To quote the report, "Following the beginning of what the Imperium now knows to be the Necron assault on the sector, La'an became plagued with a series of increasingly vivid nightmares, in which he found himself seated at a great feasting table, surrounded by terrifying deathly figures La'an himself describes as being, quote, masked in bone and gilded steel, clad in the golden and darkly jeweled raiment of barbarous alien kings and princes. Set before them were platters and dishes on which lay, alternately, grey dust, glowing cinders, and raw, bloody meat. At the head of the table is a vast enthroned figure, quote, more terrible than the rest, so fearful I knew my heart would fail if I looked directly upon them. In this dread company, La'an found himself trapped and bidden to eat the strange meal while the deathly court looked on, all watching him in malignant silence, save one, draped in raw skins that ravened at the unholy banquet, smearing bloody chunks of flesh onto its twisted mask, even though it could not eat, drenching itself with flagons of steaming blood, even though it could not drink. When, in the dream, La'an could not stand any more of this horror and cried to be let go, a hooded and shrouded figure appeared at his back and whispered to him, quote, these are the worlds that were once ours, the worlds that you trespassed upon and are now ours again. The worlds on which we have risen have already been cleansed. The worlds where we once walked, we shall now walk again. As the rites demand, you are given a cycle of the pale stars to prepare yourself for extermination. Maynarkh comes, and the banquet shall be served again. Inquisitor Nichona, being of demon hunter stock, clearly interpreted these recurrent dreams as the work of the warp, demonic emanations of the vilest sort insinuating themselves into La'an's sleeping mind, tormenting the governor with treacherous prophecy designed only to deceive La'an into surrendering intelligence on troop movements to their foul masters in the material world. Ironically, in hindsight, based on significant Ordo Xenos encounters with and study of the rising threat of the Necron dynasties in the era Indomitus, it is quite likely that everything within these dreams was the stark, literal truth. In cross-referencing La'an's case with those reported elsewhere by Inquisitors Boas, Straker, and Valyria, it is likely that La'an, despite being an Imperial commander and surrounded by the protections such as the office brings, was abducted covertly, with the Maynarch nobility deigning to treat him as the head of the forces opposing the Necrons in the region. In this, the dynasty was extending to him the ancient courtesies and honors their culture had demanded of foes prior to the Great Sleep. Even as a member of the species, the Necrons themselves consider utterly beneath them in every capacity. The experience was so clearly so unearthly, traumatic, and malign that it irrevocably damaged the mind of Governor La'an, in such a fashion that caused his surface consciousness to block it out. It remains a terrible irony that, once again, the signs of what was to come were very readily available, drawn in a string of crumbs across history, and rising to greater prominence, yet the Imperium's dogmatic and hidebound nature rendered it wholly unable to see them. On 3-970-992-M41, the Battle of Amara began as suddenly as the initial Maynarch invasion had, without preamble, preface, or prelude. No astropathic shockwave announced the Necron attack, no deep system auger sweeps detected them. At 153-4202 local timescale, a massive gravitational flux sprang into being near the Amara star, its shockwaves causing the sun to violently eject plasma and radiation into space in a series of massive solar flares. Such was the fury of these flares that the system's innermost planet, Auric, was flash incinerated on its day side in a single instant. Vox, sensorium, and auger networks across the system failed immediately, drowned in a cascade of stellar radiation, rendering much of the Imperial defenses blind and deaf. Many unshielded technologies not hardened against EMAG shocks were likewise disabled. The confusion and chaos was so total that it wasn't until the Sentinel-4 battle station in deep orbit suddenly detonated that the cause became monstrously clear. The enemy had finally come for the Imperium. At Leighton, third planet in the system, the Imperial battle fleet had been arrayed for months in a solid defensive picket, blockading what was, by any conventional wisdom, the surest route to the capital planet from the system's Mandeville point of warp translation. Such wisdom, of course, did not apply against the Necrons. As backup auguries and visual suites came online, the commanders of the fleet saw with horror that an armada of black ships hung in the near space of the dead battle station, accelerating still at speeds barely registerable. Calculus Logi stated they would be in Amara's orbit in mere minutes. The battle fleet had been utterly bypassed. To use a simplistic analogy, the enemy was within the walls. The orbital minefields and weapons batteries of Amara's near space were the next target. The invading fleet swept through them with a clinical precision, carefully constructed defenses of decades impeding them not one bit. The remaining Sentinel battle stations, each with the proportional firepower of an entire cruiser squadron, were systematically obliterated, all while the Imperial battle fleet was still firing up their engines, beating to quarters, and desperately trying to plot the fastest intercept course available. There was simply no time to interdict. Planetfall was happening with the inevitability of a bullet already fired. Unnatural storms boiled across the capital world skies, sliced through by cracks of vivid lightning. It seemed that, for all the world, the enemy rode in upon the lightning. First contact between invaders and defenders is believed to have occurred in the wide ceremonial plazas of Kaloshin Hive, where a veritable army of humanoid forms in black iron materialized in advance with no pause of fanfare, committing themselves immediately to the base slaughter of the terrified populace that fled before them. At Durinad Starport, swarms of insectoid constructs emerged from subterranean access tunnels, tearing apart the shuttles and gunships on the runways around them like a plague of ancient Catheric mythic tracts. New Vasberg, one of the planet's largest hives, was targeted by crescent-shaped enemy flyers, identified laterally as Doom Scythe and Night Shroud-class aircraft by the Ordo Xenos. The latter, in particular, launched pinpoint barrages of antimatter bombs, shredding structural supports until the hive simply imploded in a collapse that killed countless millions. While the cities were clearly the primary targets of the Necron attack, they soon began to target military installations. Foremost amongst them, the Bastion Militaris, located at the planet's northern pole. Against this, the Necron set fearsome siege constructs, hovering soundlessly above the ice flows, but unleashing apocalyptic barrages from their energy weapons and seismic obliterators, shredding and cracking the walls of the Imperial fortress. Elsewhere, the barrack blocks of Markovan Peninsula, built to house nearly 1 million guardsmen, were simply annihilated from orbit, leaving nothing but ash and fused silicate glass where once an entire army had been billeted. Despite these already punishing losses, and the ability of the enemy to simply appear within their midst, the Imperial defenders mounted what counterattacks they could muster. At Kaloshin Hive, the tanks of the Tekarn 234th Armored Battalion learned the hard way that they were quite susceptible to even the small arms fire of the Necrons, whose Gauss flares could strip the plating of a tank with ease. An open battle was death, forcing the Tekarn commanders to concentrate their forces on open plazas and thoroughfares to grant them the advantage of long range wherever possible. Engaged by rank after rank of Necron warriors, the numbers of the invaders seemed barely to be dented, and those yet damaged by Imperial shellfire began before the eyes of the defenders to reassemble their mechanical bodies. The Tekarn did not relent in their barrage, and kept firing until their cannon barrels began to glow dull red with heat. A stalemate of sorts had been struck, but one the Techarn officers knew they could not sustain, and indeed did not. Death struck them from below and above simultaneously, according to survivor testimony. The Necrons deployed their Acanthrite canoptic constructs, believed to be some of the first Imperial forces to encounter such blasphemous automatons. Unlike the canoptic wraiths who bear a similar form, Acanthrites are capable of atmospheric flight, and their thermal beams function akin to Imperial meltas. Plunging from the skies upon the column, the constructs reaped a fearsome toll of Imperial war machines. Slaughter only added to by a pincer attack from below, as canoptek tomb sentinels, horrific burrowing anthropod-like machines, burst forth, massacring what remained. Within days, Amara Prime was in ruins. Every single main hive had fallen to the Maynarkh Dynasty. No quarter or mercy was offered. No demands had been made. No reprieve was granted in the implacable xenocide. Yet loci of Imperial defenses remained intact and functioning. The Death Corps of Krieg under Marshal Venner had been deployed in Karsala Industrial District, far from the main hive conurbations. Upon the outbreak of hostilities, they immediately set about fortifying their position with trench emplacements, connecting command stations, dugouts, and ammunition dumps with the region's pre-existing utility tunnel network. Such foresight allowed them to weather the first wave of attacks relatively unscathed, the enemy seeming to avoid their fortifications in favor of weaker Imperial targets and civilian population centers. When the Krieg counterattack was launched, it came in force, and was aimed specifically at incorporating surviving Imperial forces into itself. Marshal Venner personally executed many senior commanders of surviving bands for dereliction of duty, permitting the surviving guardsmen opportunities as martyr redemptors upon the line corps front lines. The Marshal's forces swelled to over 200,000 Astra Militarum within days, as well as nearly a dozen cobbled-together squadrons of Aeronautica Imperialis aircraft. The Death Corps' renowned skills in operating in annihilated environments, such as the ruins of Amara, was highly valuable at this stage of the campaign. The Corps shifted their tactics based upon several first engagements with the Necrons, applying overwhelming artillery fire to deny the Necrons long-ranged fire at every opportunity. The relentless advance of Necron warriors was stalled by similarly implacable Krieg guardsmen, fanatical in their devotion to the Imperial cause, making great success in comparison to other Militarum forces, but at a horrific toll in lives. Marshal Venner was of course aware of the dire nature of his situation. What victories he was winning were temporary at best, and the enemy were seemingly in total control of the planet already. In perhaps archetypal Krieg mentality, he settled upon glorious martyrdom in the Emperor's name as the only route worthy of consideration. But he would not do so without a target. This he was provided thanks to reconnaissance undertaken by the Minotaur's chapter, who had established that within the ruins of New Vassburg, a step pyramid of green-black stone, the angles of which hurt the eyes of all those who beheld it, had risen from the rubble, appearing to pull bolt after bolt of lightning from the boiling skies above onto its apex. Several other lesser citadels, made of that same malignant stonework, rose around it, connected to each other by a web of angular alien trenchwork. Necron forces, in great number, patrolled this complex, and could be observed dragging human corpses into the great hungering maw of the pyramid. Venner's attack on the Necron citadel was horrendously bloody. The sentry pylons of the fortress reaped hundreds of advancing Krieg and other guardsmen within minutes, and the opening Imperial artillery bombardment was deflected by advanced energy shields of the pyramids. Committing everything to the attack, Marshal Venner was met with similar commitment by the Necrons, who unleashed a horde of warriors and canoptek constructs in the defense of their emplacements. As probing attacks against Imperial artillery began to deprecate their effectiveness, the Krieg nevertheless managed a breakthrough upon the battlefield, reaching the outlying alien citadels at the cost of thousands of their own, surrounding Necrons and bracketing them within murderous crossfire. Krieg engineers, experts in breaching fortified structures, were hurriedly deployed, cracking open each citadel in turn and rushing within. Despite the utterly unknown workings of the Xenos technology they beheld, they were, nevertheless, Krieg with explosives, and judiciously applied the Emperor's destruction to whatever power conduits or energy outputs they could determine would be effective. One by one, the Necron pyramids were destroyed, often at the cost of the soldiers that brought them down. As the death toll on Amara climbed into the billions, the Necron fleet turned its attention to the Imperial ships within the system. If Imperial commanders had believed the relatively tiny amount of Xenos ships would flee before such a vast human armada, they were sorely mistaken. With an ease that one senior officer described as almost contemptuous, the Necron ships smoothly came about and arrayed themselves against the incoming Orphean fleet, and began to accelerate to speeds that almost defied sensor readings. The Maynarkh fleet held, by Imperial readings, less than a quarter of their number, and by logistic standards, far less tonnage, with their ships being thin or small in comparison to Imperial Navy behemoths. The exception to these were two mighty tomb ships, 15 kilometers in span, with sinister pyramids crusting their surfaces. These were codified by Imperial strategos as the Sun Killer and Dead Hand for identification purposes, and marked as targets of extreme priority given their size. Having now identified the invaders as Necrons, the senior Navy officers noted that the concentration of power before them, however small in comparison to their own navy, still represented one of, if not the, largest deployment of Necron starships on Imperial record. Previous encounters were extremely rare, but had gone very poorly for the Navy, and the Mechanicus Magi aboard were frantically hailing bridge officers regarding unknowable energy readings concentrated around the largest enemy ships. On the bridge of the Apocalypse-class battleship Arica Dominus, Grand Admiral George Carew, Knight Commander of Battle Fleet Orpheus, conferred with the helmeted form of Asterion Moloch, Chapter Master of the Minotaurs, via Hololith. Moloch, himself aboard the relic battle barge Daedalus Creta, and commanding a dozen Astartes strike cruisers besides, declared that he would take a secondary echelon behind the Imperial forward battle volume, preparing to strike at a potential weak point in the Necron vanguard, or to deal with any ships that attempted a breakthrough. This was not a move poised for discussion. Moloch simply did as he saw fit, deigning to inform Admiral Carew out of basic politeness. The Admiral acceded, ordering his fleet to advance and engage only as ordered, under pain of death. Not that the Imperials would have any much opportunity to slip their leashes, as the Necron ships entered extreme weapons range even before the line of battle had been fully formed. Ranging fire was immediately ordered, through which the Necron ships passed completely undeterred. Even as a swarm of torpedoes was launched, the Xenos made no move to correct their course or take evasive maneuvers. Now entering terminal range, scores of the torpedoes simply ceased to function. They sped off in entirely new directions or exploded harmlessly on the hulls of the Necron vessels. Hoving now into lance range, the invaders finally discharged their weaponry to ruinous effect. Massive gravitational distortions were registered as Imperial ships detected incoming weapons fire approaching at nearly the speed of light. After-action reports logged by the pitiful few survivors that made it out of this conflagration later claimed that what sensor readings could track the projectiles labeled them as fragments of dead stars. The battlecruiser Richtenbach, a vessel whose service record dated from the beginnings of the Great Crusade, was hit amidships and simply detonated. It, was merely the first. Admiral Carew ordered the entire battle fleet to come about and effect broadside fire at will, clearly seeing the futility in attempting the usual careful, coordinated dance of ships that typically defined void warfare. The Necron ships sliced through the Imperial fleet amidst a hail of lance fire and macro-cannon shells, discharging their own fearsome batteries in return. Both armadas raked each other without pause or mercy, but as they parted, fully a quarter of the Imperial ships present had been destroyed or crippled beyond rescue, with barely any damage having been registered upon the Necrons. The Xenos, having passed to the rear of the Imperial fleet, were expected to begin a slow arc back, hopefully granting Carew some time to ready up another storm in response. But to the horror of all observers, the alien ship simply stopped. Their momentum was utterly, impossibly arrested. And then they simply turned. With impossible ease, the ships came about and began returning on the path they had come, straight into the exposed rear of the Imperial fleet. The second attack, perhaps predictably, was supremely more devastating than the first. Blinded by their own drive flares, the Imperial ships could barely detect the positioning of the alien vessels as they came within killing range. They were the easiest of prey. Admiral Carew bellowed disengage orders into his Vox, but it was still too late. The Retribution-class battleship Talisman of Grace was caught before the Sunkiller and sheared in half by its Gauss arrays, while the heavy cruiser Mendicatus was pulled apart mercilessly by a pack of Necron raiders, alongside dozens more craft burning and breaking in the silent void. What line of battle had remained was quickly sundered, with Imperial starships plunging in whatever direction they could, lashing out at any targets of opportunity. The Arcia Dominus, against the odds, claimed the life of a Necron harvest ship, only to be targeted in return by a trio of Necron raiders who guttered its starboard batteries and set fire to her main engineerium. Out of control, the flagship tumbled away into the void, the horrified senior command watching on flickering holospheres as the Xenos ships danced amongst the dead and soon to die like carrion beasts reveling in slaughter. Asterion Moloch of the Minotaurs, having observed the debacle, knew even his Astartes ships would likely be wholly outclassed by the firepower, durability, and maneuverability of the Xenos. The Dower Chapter Master instead ordered an immediate attack upon a single target, the tomb ship labeled Dead Hand. Adopting an attack formation in the shape of a bull's head, with the Daedalus crater forming the protected skull, and the chapter's 3 battle barges the jaws, its 8 strike cruisers the horns, the Minotaur's fleet smashed into the heart of battle, engines at full burn. The strike cost them the Daughter of Tempests, a battle barge taken as a prize in the Badab War, alongside the Fidelitas Lambda and a trio of strike cruisers. It did, however, bring the Minotaurs into the boarding range they sought. The boarding torpedoes that delivered the chapter into the heart of the Dead Hand brought the brazen Astartes into a charnel house of a wholly alien sort, one whose constructs and warriors reacted to the invading Marines as a body reacts to a virus. Losses were extreme. Within a half hour, only Terminator Squad Ixthalion survived, having fought its way into the heart of the ship's central chamber. Within that massive area, a kilometer wide, arose a great dais upon which stood the overlord of the fleet, clad in a cloak of raw darkness. It would be the last sight the warriors of Squad Ixthalion would see as Lichguard stepped from within the seemingly living darkness to butcher these human transgressors. They survived long enough to send a signal to the Daedalus crater, one the battle barge used to target the chamber and fire every weapon battery they could upon the location. Curiously, for Necron vessels, the Maynarkh tomb ship was recorded as having an atmosphere. Likely an aspect of the flare curse that befell the dynasty, for no Necron had any reason or need to breathe, the fact was exploited by the Minotaurs. The central chamber was breached by the targeted bombardment, with explosive decompression bucking the tomb ship off course. One great arm of its crescent sweep caught the Daedalus crater in a glancing blow, sending the relic battle barge spinning in space, where, aboard, Asterian Moloch, alongside his chapters in Terminator Elite and several Hecaton Contemptor dreadnoughts, crashed through the veil of reality in an audacious teleport assault. Against the sinister fleet lord did Moloch range himself, in a clash of silent, wordless fury. Their singular combat, an honor perhaps deigned by the Necron Lord, was not abided by Moloch, who sought only to kill. The Hecaton dreadnoughts of the chapter aided their master, but such was the skill of the Xenos overlord that ruin was brought upon their ancient chassis. But triumph Moloch did, impaling the sinister figure upon the black spear of the Minotaurs, before a catastrophic impact dislodged the two combatants and swept Moloch and the surviving Astartes back out into the void. The dead hand tomb ship turned slowly, pivoting away from the burning hulk of the battle barge Fidelitas Lambda. The Minotaur's ship had rammed the Xenos vessel at full speed, but this dying act had forced the tomb ship to effect a retreat. With their flagship on the move, the Xenos fleet likewise disengaged. Driven off at best, not defeated, leaving within their wake utter devastation. The Sunkiller and a dozen escorting raiders unexpectedly split from the body of the fleet and made landing on the night side of Auric, whose face was soon consumed by dark storms and pulses of unnatural radiance. The remainder, and the wounded dead hand, simply vanished, without a trace whatsoever. It is possible that they effected an acceleration so fast that Imperial augurs were unable to track them, or perhaps some altogether more unknowable technological means covered their retreat. Either way, they were gone, but the victory could hardly have been any more Pyrrhic. Less than 10% of the Imperial ships remained operational, and even these survivors bore deep, painful scars. Amara Prime, although now liberated from its primary invasion force, was a graveyard of billions. Whatever recompense the Imperium had claimed there had been bought at the most terrible price. The surviving forces were evacuated as quickly as possible from the ruins, pulled back to the outer worlds of Laemon and Kalama to regroup. Of the remnants of the civilian population, those unlucky enough to remain alive in the dark, charnel destruction, the Imperium abandoned them to whatever fate awaited. The Battle of Amara was over. By the dawning of 995 M41, the Orphean War, such as it remained, had reached a bloody, punitive stalemate. What scattered forces did not retreat from the destruction of Amara, or Hydragast, were wholly cut off from the Imperium, left to wither or sell their lives. Attrition rates along the front line reached some 60%, with no Imperial gains or advances being made. The line held, but at a staggering cost. Worse still, fresh conflicts broke out in the Chimarium system as planets fell to the hands of the arch-enemy who had launched opportunistic invasions, with the Imperium reeling from the Necron assault. At Myre and Amraphel, Xenos probing attacks were increasing, with Imperial strategos rating the possibility of a full invasion occurring as quite high. This, combined with the difficulty of immediate resupply and the utter devastation of battle fleet Orpheus during the initial invasion, led the Synod Militaris of Segmentum Tempestus to conclude that the Orpheus Sector could not be saved without the deployment of a Crusade-level military force, which, by Munitorum calculations, accounting for the already in-progress Segmentum conflicts and the vagaries of future ones occurring, would not be at the Imperium's disposal for approximately 3 to 5 decades. This report worked its way through the upper layers of the Munitorum and Administratum before being delivered to the eyes of the High Lords of Terra for a conclusive vote. It is apparent from historical records of Senatorum proceedings that the Ordo Xenos had a very heavy hand in the progress of this report. The emergence of the Maynarkh Dynasty in such force had, at the time, been one of the largest and most aggressive awakenings of the Necrons yet encountered by the Imperium, and the scale of the devastation it had unleashed had forced major synods of the Ordo to urgently re-examine their writings, protocols, and policies concerning Imperial engagement with the species. In consultation with the Deathwatch chapter of the Adeptus Astartes, the Ordo Xenos was in the process of launching exploratory and research expeditions into what remained of the Orpheus Sector, and clearly wanted to ensure little could impede their efforts. The Chamber Mori, in recommendation to the Senate and championed by Inquisitorial Representative Cleopatra Arx, advanced and passed the Orphean Decree, an Edict Imperialis that formally discorporated the sector. As of 0266-999 M41, Orpheus was no more. It did not exist. Its tithes were annulled, its authority stripped, its history sealed and committed to the deepest vaults, to be unremembered. A cordon of fortress worlds, primarily based in the neighboring Eurydice sector, were ordered constructed, and a military cordon enforced. To deny the Necrons any resources they could claim from planets still controlled by the Imperium, the Minotaurs were ordered to commit exterminatus, pending their refitting and rearmament following their losses. Thus did Orpheus fall, in cold fire. Thus did a region of Imperial space collapse. Millennia of history snuffed out in scarcely a year by a foe who had dwelled beneath its surface all along. Its fate remains as we leave it. A blackened husk of space, a testament to the blinkered ignorance of the Imperium, a loss of staggering scale, and one rendered into relative obscurity only for the immense losses and calamities the Imperium was to endure in the waning months of 999 M41. The fall of Cadia, the Noctis Aeterna, the opening of the Cicatrix Maledictum. Even for the Maynarkh Dynasty, their current disposition and fate remains unclear to Imperial scholarship. The return of the Silent King and the unfolding of the Pariah Nexus has cast new fears that the bloody-handed warriors of Zun-Bakir may throw themselves anew at the Imperial cordon that has yet to keep them in check, effecting a breakout from their dynastic heartlands in an effort to rejoin the lord of their species. This remains to be seen. As for the Minotaurs, one cannot independently confirm if their proposed exterminatus campaign was ever carried out. Their presence upon Terra during the Hexarchy crisis casts doubt upon this, but given the extreme chronological disruption to the galaxy following the Noctis Aeterna, and the curious nature of the chapter themselves, we will likely never know. For now, the Orphean War has been as totally buried as the population that once dwelt there. A shameful chapter of history that the Imperium would rather forget. Ave Imperator. Gloria in excelsis terra. This video and this channel were made possible thanks to the very kind donations and support from my Patreon subscribers. If you'd like to help support the channel, head on over to patreon.com/Oculus Imperia. If you'd like to receive more updates about the channel and any future videos, you can contact me or follow me on Twitter @Oculus Imperia. Otherwise, please like, subscribe, comment, let me know your feedback, and as ever, thank you very much for watching.